continuation of our virtual Guardia, especially in this Eastertide. And so I wanted to follow up something that we started before in the previous year. Remember in 2019, back in October, there was the famous Synod on the Amazon came out, and we talked a little bit of that was kind of the current event, or one of the major events going on in the church at the end of last year. And since October, when the actual Synod took place, well, there's been a lot of time elapsed between the final document that came out and the final word of the Pope regarding some of the ideas and notions that were brought out in the Synod, especially in the preparation of the Synod. And so this is a follow-up on what we did already in September, just before the Synod was about to be convoked. And with current events and with the problem of the quarantine and especially in Italy, this document that the Pope came out exactly when they were starting to lock down, pretty much, just in February, right when the problems were starting to come out, surfacing in Europe, is when the document, so it kind of got caught up with the news cycle, and really not a lot of attention was paid to it because there were other things that were going on at the same time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this, the conclusion of the Amazon Synod. And if you remember before in September, at the end of September, I gave kind of a brief introduction of what exactly was the Synod, what was being the items discussed, the preparatory document, which was pretty much the agenda that accompanied the Synod, questions that came up about it, some of the controversial points, if you remember. Some were regarding liturgy, about the priesthood itself, the notion of a married priesthood or a priesthood opening up to married men came out as well as one of the suggestions in the preliminary document. Ministries, or what type of ministries can be offered to women, even if they were ordained ministries, that also was alluded to in the document. And then also other questions regarding communion and the ways of expressing liturgy as well came out in that document. And what we saw last year in September was basically a preliminary agenda that came out, things that were discussed at the Synod themselves. And at the conclusion of the Synod and the group of bishops came up with a final document, which they presented to the Pope near sometime in January. And again, because of the new year and the turn of the year, that document kind of got lost in space. No one really paid attention to it. Looking at that document, and really what we're going to talk today was the Pope's reaction or his response to the final document of the Synod, which is a letter, an apostolic exhortation that's called Querida Amazonia. So we'll take a look at that today in tonight's Círculo presentation. And so looking at what exactly is an apostolic exhortation. Perhaps we have to look at a little bit what are the different documents that occur or that happen in the church. And so the first or the most important document that can be issued by the Pope is what we call an apostolic constitution. An apostolic constitution tends to be legislative, sets down, it's normative, and so it in a certain way we can say it's binding, in that it sets down norms or laws to be observed by the universal church. An example of that is what comes out of the council, for example. And so when the liturgical reforms came out of the Second Vatican Council, an apostolic constitution was sent out that allowed Mass to be said in the vernacular, in the language of the people, Mass facing the people, the rules for the new Mass, for example. That's an example of an apostolic constitution. There are not that many of those. Those tend to be connected with councils or with very serious questions. And so most of the apostolic constitutions that we really have are tied to the councils, and particularly to the newest ones, to Vatican Council II. And so those are kind of in their own right, and justly so. They're the most important documents that a pope can issue. They also reflect the magisterium, so the teaching of the church. The second most important document that could come out from the Pope is called an encyclical, and these we're pretty familiar with. Popes tend to issue encyclicals almost on a regular basis, if not a year or every other year. An encyclical comes out, and encyclicals are letters that address a certain issue being discussed in the church at the time, and gives a theological and magisterial and even doctrinal reflection and maybe instruction regarding the question. And so encyclicals have been given on the value of life. Encyclicals have been given about the nature of the family. Encyclicals have been given out on the environment, for example, the Laudato Si, Pope Francis. And so, again, they could be on any issue and offer a theological, doctrinal even, but mainly a theological and spiritual reflection upon that issue, which can be normative in itself. It can be issue norms, but it's, again, mostly a reflection that tries to present the magisterium again, or clarify the magisterium regarding a certain question. Now, the third document that could be issued is what we're looking at now, an apostolic exhortation. That's the third most important document that can be issued by the Pope. And as we see here, the apostolic exhortation is basically a message that addresses specific topics that are being discussed in the church and directs thought and action. Now, how is this different from an encyclical that also talks about a specific topic discussed in the church? Well, whereas an encyclical tends to be dogmatic and theological, the apostolic exhortation does not have to be. And so it's mostly pretty much the Pope thinking out loud. The Pope's thoughts, they may be theological, they don't have to be theological. And it's in the title, it's an exhortation. It's a call to thought or a call to action. They're not necessarily normative at the same time. If they issue norms, it can be, but they don't necessarily have to give norms or an instruction to be followed at the moment. Following, just to see the other documents, the fourth type of document that could come out that's below an apostolic exhortation, it's called the motu proprio, and in its very own name, on its own, for his own motive. He can issue an instruction or his opinion or basically anything he wants to say to the church at large. Motu proprios tend to be legislative. They tend to be just dealing with law in a very strict or very particular and specific question. And so there are different motu proprios. Sometimes they create a new office in the curia, for example. That could be in the form of motu proprio. Pope Benedict XVI, probably his most famous motu proprio, was allowing the Mass to be said in Latin and in the old form again. Again, that could be normative, that could be legislative. Other motu proprios establishing a new process for sainthood, or refining, or a question regarding sainthood. Motu proprio, again, it's whatever the Pope wants to write about. And then below is a decretal, or as the name says, it's a decree, and so it's a very specific instruction or law that can be issued directly from the Holy See with no explanation. There's just a lot to be followed. They tend to be rather, we could say, kind of mundane, kind of boring decretals. They're usually just refining a procedure. Go to this office before going to the other. No longer do you use this process, insert another process. So again, they tend to be just administrative, the decretals, and that's why probably we don't hear so much about them. And then the last type of document can be a rescript, and this is entirely legal. Normally, it's response to a specific question and directed to a specific person. And so usually it's clarification of the application of law in certain cases, or of procedure in certain cases. And again, a rescript is not that interesting. Some have been more interesting than others, but normally we don't get those don't make the news. The ones that make the news are the first three that we see here: apostolic constitution, encyclical, or apostolic exhortations are the ones that we hear about and get more press. And then finally, there are addresses too that are considered, well, issuance or official expressions from the Holy See. These are the audiences, the different speeches, letters that he's sending out. But again, these tend to be very particular, and they're not really instructive in the sense that they're letters of encouragement, perhaps, words of encouragement and welcome. So, yeah, they're not really connected into law or things that are directives of the church. And so let's look at what the Pope was wishing to do with this apostolic exhortation, because he says it in the opening paragraph. He says, and in his own words, I wish to offer my own response to this process of dialogue and discernment, talking about the synod that just passed in October. I will not go into all the issues treated at length in the final document, nor do I claim to replace that text or to duplicate it. I wish merely to propose a brief framework for the reflection that we can apply concretely to the life of the Amazon region, a synthesis of some of the larger concerns that I have expressed in earlier documents. And so what the Pope is saying here basically is, he's just this is more like an addendum. This is a reflection on the final document that the Synod had already handed him to him earlier in the year. This document can be found online. You can download it. It's a little lengthy. It's not that lengthy compared to the original working document, but you can see it in here. I'll show it so that you can see it right here. It consists of 5 chapters, and this is really a synthesis. This is the final version of that working document that we saw in September. And so it's looking at it, and I skimmed it and looked at it because it's, we could say, the more salient points of the working document that we mentioned about the ordination of married men and women and the Eucharist and all these things don't appear at all in the final document. In a certain way, the final document is very tame compared to the working or the agenda that was placed at the Synod. It's not that these issues were not discussed. Certainly they were, but they did not make the final cut. And so if we looking at the headings right here, I'll show you to them briefly. The Amazon listening to integral conversion is very close, and it's more of an abridged version of a very lengthy introduction that kind of described the Amazonian region in its demographics, in its social context, and its ecological context. And so this is really the edited version, shortened version of that initial part, which does not carry anything normative or anything theological, and it's just basically a description of the region and why attention should be brought to it. The second chapter, New Paths of Pastoral Conversion, again, is just a summary of a desire to re-evangelize or to extend the gospel to the region, noticing and listing all the difficulties that are found in there. And so we see the missionary church that accompanies the peoples of the Amazon. It's really a call, an exhortation for the church to find new ways, more creative ways, and to continue to dedicate itself to the peoples of the region. And again, describing what we see in the bottom in the other chapters, the people that live in there. What's the face of the church in the Amazon region? Who are the different peoples? What are their desires? What are their needs? That's summarized in this second chapter. Chapter 3, New Paths of Cultural Conversion. This would refer to the more controversial part of the working document. The part of the working document that talk about the new paths and the suggestions for the church to take in its mission in the Amazon get very much just a very broad treatment, very general and even abstract treatment in here. Like I said, the controversial parts aren't here. And so the questions about using yucca instead of bread for the communion, that doesn't show up at all in here. The question about the married clergy does not even make it into here. It does mention models or ways that the liturgy and the mass should be brought to the people, that they can understand it in a way that they can understand, but it doesn't tell you exactly how to do it either. And so really, it's a call for a greater compromiso, a greater commitment of the church to the region in here. And it's very descriptive, really, in the cultural values of the Amazon people, how the church is present amongst these values, and what do they have in common. Living the faith as popular piety, the importance of the piety, of the devotion, of the native devotion in there, description, very general of it, since there's so many different peoples and different cultures in that area. And then the respective cultures, especially, that the church be not one that imposes culture, but rather respects and promotes culture that is already present in there. And so, again, it's very descriptive in its words in there. And then chapter 4, the ecological conversion, speaks, and this is an issue that we saw in the working document that does make it to the final one in here, this kind of theology or ecological theology that is presented in here. Here it's given, again, a broader treatment. It's descriptive more than normative again, and talks about the need of promoting this, what we call the integral ecology, which leads to a new way of understanding God, understanding the gospel within the context of the Amazon. And then finally, paths of synodal conversion does talk in some of the other salient points of the working document, but again took all the controversy out. And so we see it right here in the second part, the new paths for church ministries, the religious life, the women's presence, the permanent diaconate. But again, it doesn't say anything that we don't know. And so, for example, when it speaks about the women's presence, it just says, again, very broadly, women are valued, women are important, and women have a very central role in the evangelization in the region, as many religious nuns have shown in the past. Regarding the permanent diaconate, the same thing. Deacons have a very important role. They have had an important role, and perhaps there should be more deacons in the region. Doesn't say anything more than that. The enculturated formation, again, it doesn't talk about changing the material that the Eucharist is, changing the Mass, nothing. It just says that all forms of liturgy and sacraments should somehow respect the cultures there, because they're very rich. But again, it doesn't really say anything too earth-shattering in there. And then the final part, the new paths for ecclesial synodality, pretty much describes the process that they just did, that the church should continue to get together and discuss ideas, not be afraid to discuss and dispute things, and to continue creating institutions and processes to meet together and to hammer out ideas. Well, that's exactly what the Synod of Bishops does. And so, like I said, the document itself doesn't really say much new. It doesn't really introduce anything very controversial or of much newsworthiness in there. And so we'll bring our attention back to what is the document that the Pope brought out, which is his reaction, his summary of the final document in here of entitled Querida Amazonia. The second thing the Pope wishes to do in this apostolic exhortation is down here. At the same time, the Pope says, I would like to officially present the final document which sets forth the conclusions of the Synod. And so he kind of endorses the document that I just summarized right now in his briefly. And as he says, he's not adding to it, he's not taking away from it. He's just offering his reflection on the final document with no amendments to be made. Now, the papal document is divided into 4 chapters, and more or less, the Pope speaks that he can derive 4 themes from this, from the document, the final document of the Synod, and he uses the term dreams. He has 4 dreams that come out of here. The first chapter of his response, of his apostolic exhortation, is called A Social Dream, and so he writes in his words, I dream of an Amazon region that fights for the rights of the poor, the original peoples, and the least of our brothers and sisters, where their voices can be heard and their dignity advanced. And so what does he mean by this social dream? Well, he mentions that colonizing interests, and he brings out this term that was used by the original document, by the working document, and hinted to again in the final document. He denounces what he calls colonizing interests that exploit natural resources in the region, and he singles out two in particular that he repeats often: forestry, in the sense of timber industry, and anything that pertains to cutting down or the trees of the forest, and mining in particular, because they exploit the natives, and they represent colonial interest, or of the previous colonial powers. And so he many times in his social dream, he repeats the denouncing of these interests that damage the area and are damaging the area in there. And so those are the interests that go against the rights of the poor, and that abuse those who live in there, the natives. He also continues that the exploitation by the colonizing interest, or the activity of forestry and mining, moves populations into cities, and so the natives are displaced from their place of living, and they end up moving to cities. And in the cities, they encounter a type of slavery in the sense of poor working conditions or increased poverty. And so he uses a very strong term. He says that word slavery, and that they become slaves to the economy that's inside the cities. And so this reflection does take, it's very kind of pointed in its language, more than the document that the Synod finally puts out. He continues that the economy, and by economy he really means global economy. The global economy for him is the greatest threat that the Amazon region and its people can face right now. And again, it's a theme that brings on, and he ends up denouncing the notion of the global economy and its effects in the Amazonian region several times in that first chapter, the social dream. And he mentions also, and it's almost like a lament, that though missionaries often protected people, and the church served as the initial protectors historically in the missions, and you can think of the Jesuit missions that were in the region, Franciscan missionaries as well, while they were the first to protect the people against the colonizing interest, eventually they sided with the oppressors in that they tended to be representatives of those same nationalities themselves. And so he asks for forgiveness from the Amazonian people for the church's complicity in some of these colonizing interests. In a certain way, well, it's almost a catch-22. While the colonizers were Portuguese and Spaniards, and the missionaries tend to be Portuguese and Spaniards, well, by their very association to the countries, they end up being the oppressors at the same time, or representing the oppressors at the same time. And so he's asking forgiveness for that. He mentions that new and social cultural systems may be created that foster fraternity and culture of encounter. And this is a theme that we find many times in Francis's writings and thought, the culture of encounter. And it's actually a Jesuit term, a Jesuitical term, if you will. Culture of encounter. It's called la cultura del encuentro. And what is encounter but, well, the face-to-face? It is the accepting and understanding of a person, kind of what was at face value, what you see in front, and what can only be derived from the face-to-face and personal encounter. The opposite of what is going on right now. I mean, the fact that I'm talking to you behind the screen is not the culture of encounter. This is a culture of virtuality. And so in a sense, he's talking exactly the opposite of what we're doing, or what we've been forced to go into right now. And he says this encounter of a culture of encounter eventually opposes discrimination and injustice. It's a way around it, in a way of overcoming the colonizing interest or all the baggage that was brought along with that history. And then he laments at the end of the social dream that the church, or the members of the church, tend to be part of the corruption. And so the corruption that exists in the area, the social corruption that exists, unfortunately is brought by Christians. And this is something already that the original document kind of alluded to, saying that the church has perpetrated crimes in the area. And so Pope Francis is kind of validating that idea. And so he just throws in kind of this caveat that organizations, especially church organizations or the faithful, should pay attention to where donations and money come from, because they could be coming from controlling interest or from the colonizing interests and used to exploit others as well. And so the first chapter, again, as it's called, the social dream, is really a social commentary. It's a little bit of a sociological commentary on the region and the state of the church based on what the final document spoke about. Chapter 2 is rather brief. It's called the Cultural Dream, and so this is the second thing that the Pope addresses, whereas first he looked at into sociological, general sociological and socioeconomic view. Now he looks at a strictly anthropological or cultural view. And he mentions, I dream of an Amazon region that can preserve its distinctive cultural riches, where the beauty of our humanity shines forth in so many varied ways. And this part is actually very poetic in the sense that he quotes a poem. There's several poems and songs that are placed into this text, which end up being basically is just expounding upon some poetry that refers to the region, to nature, to the ecology. And so it's almost an ode to the cultures that exist in there. And so different poems from the cultures are just presented and kind of expounded upon in there. He does mention that the church must educate in an area that has very little formal education as we know it. However, education cannot change or should not change the culture. If education changes the culture, then it's colonization in the Pope's thought. And so the church be careful in the way it educates, in that it respect the culture, and the culture of the region should, the different cultures should be respected to the most it can. And while the church is called to educate, and education has been always a mission of the church, it should be very careful of how it does it, so as not to dominate the existing cultures in there or fall into the problem of colonization. He continues that myths and legends should be conserved, native myths and legends, because they are the source of culture and education, or native education or autochthonous education. And so the church should be very respectful of all the myths and legends that come in there, because they're the sources of culture and should be conserved. Respect for native quality of life should not impose on foreign ideas of quality of life. And this goes back kind of to the first chapter where he mentions the colonizing interests and the global economy. He mentions that the global economy imposes a quality of life, or the desire for a quality of life, that is not attainable, or that was never desired by the original tribes and cultures of the region. And so as the church educates and works in this region, the native sense of a quality of life that is already proper to that region should be kept. And we should be careful of not importing foreign ideas of quality of life that are either unattainable or attainable at a price that they cannot pay, or at the cost of an ecological damage of the area. And so, again, it's a very nuanced and kind of pointed at the same time critique of the global economy and how it ends up damaging culture or altering culture. The third chapter is called an Ecological Dream, and so it's the third theme of the papal reflection. In the Pope's words, he says, I dream of an Amazon region that can jealously preserve its overwhelming natural beauty and the superabundant life teeming in its rivers and forests. And so this goes more in an ecological or a biological ode to the region, talking about its natural resources And it's more descriptive, following that original opening chapter of both the preliminary document and the final document of the Synod. In it, he mentions that liberation is found in caring for the ecology. And so liberation is not really defined in here. I'm not sure exactly liberation from what, but it's mentioned that the ecology liberates those who take care of it. And so that's a virtue to be found in there. The care of the environment is another way to reverence and serve the Creator. And so he uses more the care of creation for the word for environment, is another way to serve and reverence the Creator, which is something that's very Ignatian at the same time, as we see that's even related and found in the Principio Fundamento. And so finding in that, it's kind of continues in that exhortation for a greater environmental sensibility. And it kind of ends with this ode to water, a poem to water and a song to the Amazon River, composed by another artist. He just quotes the entire song and the entire poem, and kind of continues to think and continue to eulogize the region and its natural resources. He ends with one more critique again of economic or global economy, and says that economic development seems to be a necessary evil. There's no way around it. Economic development is going to happen one way or another, and if it's to happen, then it should be controlled in a way as not to alter the lifestyle or culture of the region. And so again, there's this continuous critique of the global economy and economic, the effects of the economic system, that these effects be mitigated in a certain way, never at the price of the lifestyle already that's there or the culture of the region. He brings again the analogy of slavery, where he mentions that the Amazonians are like the Hebrews who are enslaved in Egypt and are waiting to be freed. And again, I'm not sure exactly where that analogy is leading to, because it just stuck there at the end, and like I said, I'm not too sure where that was going. And it does mention one thing that was presented in the preliminary document. It's repeated in the finalized document, and I'd mentioned this was one of the controversial points in that the Synod brought up, because it claims that the Amazon is a locus theologicus, and if you remember what the term meant, it's a theological place. A locus theologicus is a theological term that's used as a place that is a source of revelation. And so, for example, sacred scripture, that's a locus theologicus. It's a place of revelation. A locus theologicus could be also, well, the words of Jesus. That's a place where you find revelation. Jesus himself is a locus theologicus. So these are places where revelation comes. And so it extends this concept that that there's a source of divine revelation in the forest of the Amazon. And it continues saying that if we could be in communion with the water and the river and the forest, that communion with nature is a way of praying. And thus it becomes a locus theologicus, a place of revelation in itself. And the final chapter, the Ecclesial Dream. And so this is the fourth theme that the Pope brings out. And in his words, he says, I dream of a Christian community, of Christian communities capable of generous commitment, incarnate in the Amazon region, and giving the church new faces with Amazonian features. And so what does he mean by this? What are his thoughts regarding that? One, that the church must respond to the needs of the region with organizations, technical resources, discussion, political programs, and also the gospel. He continues kind of to describe the different types of organizations, resources, discussions, and possible programs, but does not really go into much depth or or detail exactly what kind of discussion or what kind of political programs or how the gospel should be put. It's kind of just in general terms laid out. He invites the poor to be friends in the Lord. And in addition to alleviating the material poverty of the poor, that the church also defend their rights. And again, I have to say, this is kind of like what I was saying with the document. It doesn't really say anything new because, well, the church has always been defending the rights and has tried to alleviate the material poverty of the region. And so, well, it's a continuation of what has been done there. He does mention that the gospel is not limited. I should correct that. I should say the gospel is not limited to one cultural expression. And so to be careful to not import foreign cultural expressions that can suppress native expressions. This is what he means by enculturation. And so this is another Jesuit term, enculturation. If you were to look at it in the dictionary, you probably wouldn't find it. And it refers to how do we adapt or how do we enter a culture, a foreign culture, especially one that doesn't have much in common with the arriving or the guest culture. He mentions that because the gospel is not limited to one cultural expression, missionaries have to be careful not to impose their own culture with the gospel. And it seems that that's the way history has gone. Well, it almost seems an inevitable part of history. And so if the missionary is Portuguese, well, guess what language the gospel is going to be preached in? Usually Portuguese, although we do hear that many of the missionaries, especially the Jesuit ones, learned the native languages and translated the gospels to the native languages as well. But with it comes a way of thinking, perhaps a cultural way of acting, traditions, for example, that are connected to cultures that end up getting ingrained or co-opted by the receiving culture. And so that this kind of wariness of being of being able to change or importing things that are not proper to certain cultures in the name of the gospel should be thought of. Amazonian holiness is found in encounter and engagement. Again, that kind of buzzword, encounter, and engagement in contemplation and service, community, receptive solitude, sobriety, and struggle for justice. This is interesting in the point that he creates, he mentions a type of social holiness. And so he says holiness within this very unique region or unique situation is found in encounter, engagement, contemplation, service, community, receptive solitude, sobriety, and struggle for justice. And they almost seem kind of like, kind of polar ends. Encounter and engagement, but solitude at the same time. Contemplation and service, but also struggle. And so they seem to be conflicting ideas, but all come together to create a new type of holiness, a social holiness that is applied to the area. That is just in a nutshell the letter, Querida Amazonia, that the Apostolic Exhortation the Pope sent in response to the conclusion of the Synod. It's downloadable. You can find it on the Vatican site. And they'll just conclude with just some particular points of instruction that show up, or some salient points that come out at the end upon reading the letter. Just a couple of points here. The first is regarding the liturgy, and that was one of the more polemical and debated points of the preliminary document. And what he garners from that final document is that native spiritualities should be connected to the sacraments, and since they can express the mysteries of faith in a more natural way. And so again, it doesn't tell us exactly or specifically how native spirituality should be connected to the sacraments, but says that, well, a way should be found to connect these two in a way that so that the sacraments can speak to them in their own language, so to say, in their own spiritual language. The caveat with that is that, well, some might interpret that perhaps in a less orthodox way. Liturgy should reflect song, dance, ritual, gestures, and symbol of the natives. Again, this is not new. You can find this in the Vatican Council documents on liturgy. that liturgy should be reflective of regional expressions of culture, such as dance, song, ritual, and gesture. But again, it doesn't specifically say which symbols or what symbols should not be taken, for example, because there are some native symbols of the region that are contradictory, perhaps, to some of what has been revealed or what we believe in. There was already quite a commotion in there with the statue of what was called Pachamama, which is the spiritual, the icon of motherhood, but of Mother Earth as the source of fertility, or a fertility icon. Would that be something constant, or would that be something that can be put together with liturgy or not? Sacraments should be made available to the poor. Well, again, there's nothing that's said before that they should not be available to the poor, but it's an instruction, or kind of the most instructive part. It says that sacraments should be made available to the poor, and that financial reasons should never be an obstacle, kind of hinting that sacraments should not be offered for money. I'm not sure exactly where this came from, because it didn't seem to be an issue in the preliminary document nor in the final document. It kind of just shows up out there. And so I'm not sure what provoked that instruction. And it said that the discipline of the church should not be an obstacle to receiving the sacraments. And I number this one, so if you'd like to take a look at it, number 84, because this perhaps might be the most controversial line in the entire exhortation. The discipline of the church should not be an obstacle to receiving sacraments, and the example that is used is that, well, and without mentioning exactly what part of discipline, but it says that the severity or lack of possibility of observing the discipline of the church should not stop one from receiving communion, for example. This can be interpreted in a very dangerous way, I think, and it's something that needs to be clarified, because the discipline of the church could be, for example, well, the discipline of the Western Church is that priests are taken from celibate men. Does the discipline of the church in here stand in an obstacle to a married man then receiving the sacrament of ordination, of holy orders? That could be argued on just that line alone. A polygamous union amongst natives, which is common in that area, would that be considered discipline? Would monogamy be considered a discipline of the church that should not pose an obstacle to a polygamous union to receiving the sacraments anyway, if that's what the culture has? So that's, I think, one line to look at and to keep in mind, because it could definitely be interpreted in very wayward ways. And finally, it mentions ecclesial ministries should be enculturated in the same way that holiness, the gospel, and spirituality can be enculturated. And so, again, it doesn't offer specific ways of doing this, just rather descriptive, and says that efforts to be made must be made for more frequent celebrations of the Eucharist by ministers who know the culture or are part of the culture. And well, this almost sounds like common sense. It's the best ministers to a culture are the ones who are from that place in there. So, and that part doesn't offer much new. However, it does clarify one thing, that the priest is the only one who can preside at the Eucharist and confession. And this seems to be a response to one of the suggestions made in the preliminary document that, again, can it be the presiding of the Eucharist, or can the Eucharist be celebrated by non-ordained people, by women or by deacons, for example, that are not ordained as priests? Can they also be the celebrants? And so it's very interesting that the most clear language is actually regarding to that question, where it says really the priestly ministry stays priestly. The Eucharist is tied to the priesthood. The priesthood is tied to the Eucharist. And so that cannot be substituted. They cannot be changed in there. The solution is to promote more missionary vocations from the diocese. And so bishops should look to send more priests and to encourage more priests to go into the area. And he finishes with a call for lay people to step up, assume leadership and formative roles, to be catechists, to be teachers, to be lay ministers, to bring the church to places where the priest cannot be, and kind of to hold the ground and to hold the line until the priest can show up in a sense. So it's a call again for lay people on the roof. And finally, Amazonian ministry is by its nature itinerant. And so because a lot of the tribes and people live there move around from place to place, it's not permanent, thus the ministry itself is not fixed in a certain place. And so one difficulty that shows up, and it's admitted in the text of the letter, at the end of the letter, is there's a lot of talk of community, but community assumes stability. And so how do you form community when everyone's always on the move? Now, this is not a problem that's just found in the Amazon. It's found everywhere, especially in cities. They're largely transient populations. And so how do you form community when everyone's always moving around on a regular basis? And so it mentions that this is a problem in the Amazon region, and how to see community or form a community when everyone's moving around, and when the minister himself has to be moving around either with the people or to other places. And so this kind of concludes the reflection, and as the Pope said in his words, again, he does not plan to add or to change anything that's inside the final document, but really this is what he thought about in his reading and reception of that document. Well, with nothing else, bid you guys a good evening. I suppose if there are any questions or comments.
Father, I would like to just dialogue a little bit. I don't want to take too much time, but a couple interesting points, and they're not necessarily all connected, but I want to start with the fact that the Pope references the closing document. Is there any kind of legislative attachment or any rulemaking, or there gives it any power by the fact that the Pope incorporates it into the Apostolic Exhortation?
The document has a title, Apostolic Exhortation, although, like I say, it doesn't really have anything normative in it. It's really an exhortation in that sense. It's a call for greater thought, but it's not giving specific action to be done.
Okay. And a couple of points that I found interesting, this locus theologicus, why the Amazon? Could we look at the Serengeti in Africa? Could that be a locus theologicus? The Great Plains in the U.S., Siberia? Why the Amazon?
I think because of its uniqueness. I mean, because one whole chapter is devoted to its ecological uniqueness, the water, the river, the forest in itself. Because it's a unique place in the world, perhaps that's why that importance is given to it. Obviously, it's not the only rainforest in the world, but definitely, I think it does have a unique place in the world, though.
But does it stand that we can make that argument for other geographical locations in the world?
I suppose, yeah. I mean, I guess more thought has to be given by those people, those places, or someone in those places to make the case as they did for this one. Yeah.
You brought up paragraph 80, I think it was 84. Paragraph 68 sort of stood out to me. The Pope, it refers to another exhortation that he wrote, but there's a phrase there, grace supposes culture. And he discusses sort of this dialogue between the gospel and an existing culture, where the gospel comes in and can enrich an existing culture. But the Pope also indicates that there's a dialogue back to the gospel, that the culture then dialogues with the gospel and reveals a certain truth to the gospel. I can understand where, somebody who's informed in the gospel can take the gospel to a new culture and bring light to that culture. What are the rules, I guess, or what are the guideposts for us to discern what within the Amazonian culture would enrich the gospel? How does that dialogue come back? As the Pope is indicating, there's sort of a to and fro between the gospel and the culture. How do we look from the lens of the culture to then inform the gospel?
I think where he keeps on going back to is, again, that cultural uniqueness and that ecological uniqueness. I guess that communion with nature that maybe it's not found so much in the gospel, but invites perhaps one to read or understand the gospel in light of something that's probably not that explicit in the actual in Scripture.
Okay. Yeah. And then also, when you mentioned that the Amazonian ministry is itinerant, there's so many different micro cultures within the Amazon, it almost seems like a daunting task to try to have that conversation with every little mini culture within the Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And again, the notion also is brought up that they all come together too, that these cultures speak amongst themselves as well. Although we do know there's a reality, there's certain cultures that don't want to speak with each other, and they're the incommunicable, those that have willingly separated and don't want to have any contact with with the outside world or with other cultures around them as well.
Yeah. Is there a danger for syncretism if we get engaging in this dialogue?
Well, certainly there are two passages in there that I highlighted that can lead to that, bring that danger if someone wants to read them in the wrong way. And so just to find them in here at the end, that the native spiritualities should be connected with the sacraments, since they can express the mystery of faith in a more natural way. We have to be careful because some of the native spiritualities express ideas that are very contrary to the sacraments. And the one I just keep on always going back to is polygamy. Polygamy is something that's found in there. In some of the other cultures also, there is a practice of abortion or exposing of children that are unwanted or that have defects, and they'll just leave them to die. It's a very kind of pagan or ancient thing. I mean, you find in the most primitive cultures that was done, and it was done even in ancient Rome up to a certain point. And so, yeah, I mean, if that can be read, no, I think it can be applied in a wrong or a very incoherent way. And then number 84, I think, is for me is the one that sticks out the most. That the discipline of the church should not be an obstacle to receiving the sacraments, because that definitely makes can create a relativist argument of saying, yeah, well, it's okay for Westerners to do this, but then Amazonians can do the opposite because it's part of their culture. And so that, yeah, like I said, there are some things that can draw flags.
Because people can apply that mentality to other cultures.
Right, to say, yeah, why not in Amazon, then why not in Germany? And so,
right. And you mentioned so many practices in the Amazon, and not just in the Amazon, there's probably other cultures out there in different areas of the world where some practices are very antithetical to the gospel. Mm-hmm. And while a lot of what's in this passage is very being welcoming and understanding of the culture, but I sense a bit of a fear to say that there's certain things that will have to be discarded. Mm-hmm. Things that are antithetical to the gospel in whatever culture the gospel encounters. Mm-hmm. We have to discard certain things. It may be inevitable.
Yeah, one thing I thought a lot about, especially with the word enculturation that showed up so many times, and it is a buzzword in the Jesuit world now, still today, is exactly how that happened. Because, I mean, we can't deny that, yes, over time, the church has enculturated it. There are things that adapted and co-opted from, for example, Roman culture. That's the one I know the best because that's what I study. And so that, that we co-opted and we ingrained for our own use, and in a certain way we baptized it. So, for example, the use of incense in the liturgy and all that, it became baptized. We weren't the ones who made it up. It was already existing. We just co-opted and we baptized it. There are other things that we've done too as well. So, why is it okay then and not okay now? One thing that I've noticed, or at least thinking in the long term, of things that are enculturated, it ends up being, and maybe it's the politically incorrect term or a term that we don't use now, but I say they end up being tolerated, and really in all the sense of the word tolerated. What do you tolerate something? When you see something's not going to change in a certain way, or certain things that we have in it that that stay ways of being, we allow them, we tolerate them, we live with them. And so I think in the long history of the church, those phases of enculturation are not immediate, and they're not arbitrary or even determined. Over the course of time, and by time I mean hundreds of years, we start seeing certain actions or customs and all that get ingrained, that could be from the receiving culture, that get intertwined into it, and we let it go, we let it stay. That's what I think the enculturation really is. And so I think we have we have the temptation to want to impose it or, have it all figured out now, and, in a matter of weeks in the commission, and there we go, we've done enculturation. And that's not the way I'm looking right now. For example, in the history, how did the Slavonic language get pulled into, became a liturgical language? The language of the church was always first Greek, then Latin, and the two coexisted side by side for the longest time. When the missionaries left the Greek areas of Constantinople and went into what's the Slavic regions, some of these missionaries, they brought Greek with them, and they started to allow or translate things into Slavonic. The Greek church and the authorities didn't like that. At the beginning, they said, no, don't do that. They have to learn Greek. But the missionaries just went ahead and did it. And after a while, and after several years, there was this church already existing that was speaking Slavonic, that had everything Slavonic. And after a while, the church says, the other, the Roman and the Greek church says, okay, fine. You guys have been doing it for 100 years. We have no problem with it anymore. And so again, it ends up being so you end up tolerating, not something that you actually thought it out and said, okay, this is what I'm going to enculturate.
Yeah. So it's definitely a process that takes a significant time. I think you've mentioned before recently to us how we tend to operate in time as in worldly time, as in bottom line time, as in let's get it done quickly time, and church and God and the church operate on a different time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it tests our patience to listen and to wait and to see what the Spirit's going to do. So I thank you, Father. I think that was very enlightening on the document, and certainly there are still some questions that will be answered in God's time, most certainly.
Indeed.
So, well, very good. I think that'll wrap us up for tonight. Thank you again. Thank you for all of those that joined us tonight. We appreciate your participation. If you have the opportunity, if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our channel. Follow us. We have plenty of videos. Father Signs his homilies. Many of our other presentations are on our channel. So please follow, subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday, beginning with our 8 p.m. Mass.